we can talk a little bit about, what is this institution of physics and why does this matter in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion? So it's important to note that all disciplines in STEM have histories of colonization that serve to standardize practices and people. And so I think the biggest example in science that we can think of is this notion of women in coding and how it became, how it went from a female-dominated field to a male-dominated field. And so we know that after World War II, there's a lot of vacancies for these positions. And so that helped women matriculate into the workforce. But the reason why they were doing most of this, behind the scenes math was because it was seen as a soft skill, it was seen more as a secretarial work. And it was actually the building of computers that the actual putting together the engineering of computers was considered to be the more challenging force. So when they wanted to expand computer science, they essentially created a lot of exclusionary practices that make it difficult for women to continue learning in computer science by creating creating stipulations on education requirements and things like that. And they also created weird propaganda about women's ability to do computer programming. So they essentially said that women were more likely to commit human error, or they were just inherently women. we're just inherently more likely to do human error, which is completely non-factual. But again, this is just the context I was bringing in earlier, why it's important that we understand how things like history, culture, policy, and society intersect. And so now let's talk about how that's related to diversity. And so what happens in STEM disciplines is that it's created this notion of whiteness as a rhetorical construct, and that has served to exert the power to define others as other. And when I say other, I mean groups that are, Indigenous, Black, African-American, Hispanic, Latino, Asian, Pacific Islander, anything that is considered non-white. And it's quite nebulous in nature because its role is to exert power over describing people as not white to maintain social structures. And so I would also like to just point out for a second that there are 4 different types of, or 4 different levels of racism. So I think a lot of people, when they think about racism, they really focus on the interpersonal. So these microaggressions and things like that. But it really also comes down to even internalized misogyny or beliefs about yourself. And then we have things like institutional. So as I mentioned, I looked at the chemistry graduate program. And so institutions are things that are bounded entities that create policies and practices that then exert race, class, and gendered ideas. And then we have structure, which is essentially all of the institutions together. And so an example of structure is the structure of education. So education as a system or a collection of institutions, which has interpersonal workings going on because of people's personal or internalized beliefs about race, class, and gender. And so now I just wanted to bring up that diversity, equity, and inclusion is a very nebulous term as well. And this is why it's important to consider notions of intersectionality, which is a way of understanding social relations by examining intersecting forms of discrimination and how these discriminations compound. For example, I am a white Latina, so the way I navigate the world is going to be vastly different from even my sister, my parents, things like that, because it's important to consider things like nationality, ethnicity, if you have disabilities, age even, language, those are all things that are important. And the reason why I'm bringing this up now too is because when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's important to ground and contextualize this in questions you want to ask about your own institution. So for example, Purdue is a land grant institution. So Purdue exists because of the Morrill Act. And a lot of issues in terms of trying to recruit more representation and more diverse groups is centered around why aren't these communities here in the Midwest? Well, the Morrill Act specifically disenfranchised Black farmers from participating. And also West Lafayette itself is called a sundown town, which I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with the history, but essentially that is the notion of a curfew imposed on Black communities. So after a certain period of time, they were not able to go outside. And so people ask, like, why aren't there people in Indiana? Well, this is why. And so again, when you're thinking about diversity, equity, inclusion within your institution, thinking about your student populations and where do you want to start in terms of that?